everyone. I'm very excited to be hosting this event today, and I'm really happy that you're all here. I'm Noor Halabi, and I'm an anthropologist and a visual storyteller. I have an undergraduate degree in television and filmmaking. In my master's, I decided to shift into anthropology because I have a passion towards visual anthropology and documentary filmmaking. I'm one of the alumni in residence fellows, currently also working as a part-time instructor of anthropology at the American University of Beirut. And I'm very excited to be among you today, along with our wonderful guest panelist, Dr. Louis Yako. So some of you might know Dr. Yako or might have connected with him on Baobab. Dr. Yako is an independent Iraqi-American anthropologist, a writer, poet, and journalist. He has written for a range of publications, including Counterpunch, Open Democracy, and The Feminist Wire. His latest book is titled Bullets and Envelopes, Iraqi Academics in Exile, and it was published in 2021, which is an anthropological examination of the social and intellectual history of Iraq, told through the academic, political, and social experiences of Iraqi academics in exile. I'm very happy that you could be with us today, Dr. Yako. I would first maybe start by just briefing what anthropology is. And if you could also type in the chats what your majors are, what your career backgrounds are. It's a good way to connect with each other. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so now you can all see my screen. We're gonna start by tapping in what anthropology is and what does it mean to bring anthropology into your life and how that can be practical, but also very interesting. So to start with, first, anthropology in brief terms is the study of people. It is holistic and committed to look at the whole picture of human life, the culture, biology, history, and language across space and time. So it is when we stop to observe and make connections. It is when we participate in the everyday life of people we study, which we call informants, because they inform our worldviews. I like this mantra so much. Anthropology makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. My professor always uses this, and it's one of my favorites. Now, let's take a stroll in the history of anthropology. It dates back approximately 150 years, and it was about people getting out of the city, leaving their mainstream lives to travel different places and see how people were living there. This has created beneficial connections, of course, and brilliant information pieces. However, people were reflecting on anthropology and over the years, and they started to ask themselves, how did really anthropologists move out of their cities? As they went to study people, anthropologists usually carried with them their money, their books, their medication, their food, and other material as well. But they also carried with them, along with their material objects, they carried with them their concepts, their mindsets of what things should look like. And seeing those new places with their own lenses sometimes blinded them from actually realizing how people lived elsewhere and in different places. And we can say that in times there was some sort of intellectual colonization. Okay, so moving in now, bringing in the history, taking from the history and bringing it to the present, what we are here today for is introducing anthropology, but also how it matters in your own life and what ways you can apply it. This is why we talk about applied anthropology, and it is interdisciplinary. It refers to the use of anthropological theories, of methods, insights to address practical problems and challenges that we are facing. So in response to the global pandemic, the climate crisis, failed governments, our awareness as people everywhere, and also as anthropologists, is called to think how we can decolonize anthropology and other disciplines. What tools do we need to actually solve these problems we're facing? By applying anthropology, we need to observe, we need to participate, but also we need to collaborate with our informants. This type of research produces informant-led representations instead of only anthropological first-hand observations. And this is also a quote I love by Sarah Pink. She's a visual anthropologist, and she says, doing activism is itself an everyday life activity, often performed in environments such as homes, gardens, or local neighborhoods. Existing understandings emerging from everyday life studies often comprehend the everyday as a site for resistance. And I like these words, site for resistance, while describing the everyday life, because it really is, if we think about that. So, Dr. Yako, I'm really interested to ask you this question, which is, how can anthropological knowledge be applied to address real world problems faced by communities, and let's say especially marginalized communities? So I'm going to stop my screen to see you. Okay.
Thank you, Noor, very much, and for this wonderful presentation, actually, and very short and very informative, packed with information. And I think in every field of study, it's very important for us to always think about not only be users of that field, but also producers. So I shouldn't just be eating tomatoes. I should plant tomatoes and grow them and be able to harvest them. And knowledge works like that. We should be active participants in knowledge. But how can we successfully be active participants in knowledge? I think one way to do that is by trying to understand the depth of our struggles in our own communities and how those struggles are connected to other communities in the world. So this is very important. Some people think, oh, I know my society very well, but you'll be surprised as you begin learning about other societies and other places in the world. You will discover yourself in the process. The idea that many of the external journeys we take are journeys within as well. The Lebanese philosopher Khalil Gibran famously said, "They tell me if you know yourself, you will know all the people." And I say, you will not know yourself until you know all the people out there. So knowing the people is a big part of process of knowing ourselves and our communities. So the idea of knowing, I think, is also to think about, how do we know? What are the tools that we use? So anthropology, as Noor said, has many approaches, and it's very cross multidisciplinary. It is a field that is cross-pollinated by multiple other fields. It draws from them. So sometimes anthropology, I had a great professor when I was a PhD student at Duke who told me, theory is not just something that comes from some European old man with a beard. You can theorize. If you're sitting on a bus and there's a lady next to you from the village and she says something very important, you hear the lady say something very important, you could take that sentence and theorize. It could be something she says that is from the depth of her community and experience. So then my professor says, theory is where you find it. So we need to learn where to find, all the many places and the unexpected places to find theory. You could walk and talk to farmers and they will teach you something no theorist could ever imagine, right? So that is where we begin to turn this knowledge that we have into a living experience and use these tools. But like what we need to do as well is to bridge the gap between theory and practice. I believe that writing and thinking, which includes anthropology, we begin with something we know, and then we always discover in the process into something we never knew. So for example, when I started my research, I collected a lot of data. But when I put all the data together, I never imagined what would come out of it. In fact, I can tell you something very honest. I saw some data I collected talking about, like showing me the evidence that I need to discuss, for example, ethnic violence. And then I said, this is a complicated area. I don't want to go there. But then as I looked at my data and analyzed it and interpreted and tried to create themes, because in anthropology, one of the big things we do, we look for patterns. you talk to a lot of people, you observe, you understand, and you see what patterns are emerged, and you start to put them together. What are they telling you? So eventually I ended up writing a whole chapter about ethnic violence and how it affects education, ethnic and sectarian, something I didn't think I knew enough about, something I didn't think I was qualified to do. But talking to people, they taught me a lot that I couldn't even believe it when I saw a whole chapter I had written just based on the depth of the people. And then I checked information, and I found a lot of it was very true. People said this, it checked out in many ways. And of course, you do your job of analyzing and interpreting. So going back to the question, it's really critical for us to the idea that there's not the separation between writing and living is artificial. There's a French novelist who says, I shall live badly if I don't write, and I shall write badly if I don't live. And the reason why I think anthropology is a beautiful field, it's because you're able to turn the living experience into writing and turn a writing into something to change the world. And so that kind of relationship. So this is how we get all these tools, and that you can always theorize. I mean, you don't have to, sometimes when you describe, let's say, your village, you describe it in detail. You may end up describing thousands of villages that look like you, and thousands of people that feel like you, and thousands of farmers who have experienced similar problems and problems, let's say poverty, lack of employment. Let's say they've experienced, for example, you name it. I mean, so in discovering yourself and being very authentic, then you can learn. Other communities will read that and say, oh, this is exactly what happens to me. This is how I feel. So you'll be reaching out to many, many more people than you think. So I don't know if this answered the question, but happy to say more if there's a gap or something too.
I'm really felt that with the way you said writing is like living. It is really true, because as we start to write, we start to experience living, the experience of living by writing, and it's vice versa. And I find this really interesting. And also the way you said that theory is everywhere, so we just have to look and observe to be able to see. But how can we know, my second question goes that, how can we know that if we're writing, we're not colonizing by the writing practice? And how, and what do we mean basically by decolonizing knowledge, and how does it play a role when we want to apply anthropology?
Very good question. It's very big, and there's a lot to say about this. So I think it's very difficult to do justice, but I can say some things that I hope will lead people to discover and to think about other things. Like I can say, let's say, bullet points to help. Decolonizing knowledge production is and decolonizing like knowledge is something that it's a project that has been going on for a long time. And some of the key people that wrote about it was Frantz Fanon in his very famous book, The Wretched of the Earth. And Fanon was from Martinique. He was a Black man, he was a psychologist, and he spoke French. And he saw how we are colonized, how we begin to actually see, like not even see ourselves, only validate our value through what the colonizers tell us. So if you notice, very often, for example, to talk about colonization, if you say a European philosopher does this, everybody is happy and take it very, like, it's like a very serious thing. But if you say a Nigerian writer said this, people just don't take it seriously. If you say a Ghanaian newspaper published this, it's not that trustworthy, but CNN is trustworthy. All of these are colonizing methods of giving more value to some than others. So to decolonize, it's not to dismiss the other. It's to see the value in everybody else. So when I say I want to decolonize literature, I'm not saying Shakespeare is not a good writer. He's a great writer. But I'm saying he's not the only great writer, and he's not the only one we should be studying. There's a great writer from Nepal. There's a great sociologist from Peru, a great novelist from Uganda, from Egypt, you name it. And all of them need to be on the table because everybody brings new ideas. So decolonizing knowledge is given an equal space for other people to contribute. And here is the thing. The colonizers make it like everything comes out of Europe, and they talk about enlightenment and how great Europe is and every invention. But is that true? If you go and do a lot of research, for example, some decolonial thinkers in South America have discovered that a lot of what the environmentalists today are talking about, all these fancy methods, they're talking about preserving environment and certain practices for the earth, they've been done for thousands of years by indigenous people who got killed and eradicated. So they've been done already, this relationship between the person and the earth and the product. So to decolonize is not to say something doesn't exist until a Westerner finds out about it or until the Westerner starts talking about it. If it exists in our communities, we need to bring it to the discussion and take it very seriously. So that's what I think it means. Again, I repeat, it doesn't mean we dismiss a great book from France. There are great philosophers from France, indeed, and good theorists from the US, but they are not the only ones. And also, not to think about knowledge that only serious knowledge comes from the West. Take yourselves as thinkers very seriously. And that's really a key in decolonization. The African-American writer, Toni Morrison, she's a great novelist, one of the greatest who wrote really about the Black struggle in America. She has a line, she was asked in an interview in the 80s in Ohio. She was asking, why did you write your first book? And listen to the answer. To me, this answers decolonization. It's a recipe. She said, I wrote my first book because I wanted to read it. Nobody has written it. And then she also had said elsewhere, if there is a book you really want to read and it has not been written, write it. So that is what decolonization means. If you feel you live in a city anywhere in the world that nobody cares about, nobody thinks about, and you say, the city, I know my city has a lot of contributions and the world never talks about it. Write about your city, write about your community, whatever the topic is. And that's why I think Toni Morrison teaches us a beautiful lesson in what does it mean to be contributors to knowledge, not only consumers, and not only consumers of a knowledge that comes from the core, the power. So to decolonize is to decenter. Like we shouldn't have just one center of knowledge and everybody else is just, and quite honestly, one of the sad things, and we need a lot of work of this in the world, is that many educational institutions in Africa, the Middle East, South America, and I've seen them, they still just teach European, British, German philosophers. They don't teach their own. So going back to the question of decolonization, one of the great books I told you is The Wretched of Earth by Fanon, but another very influential article, which is only written in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but I've read a lot of articles about it by other decolonial thinkers from Argentina, from Peru. It was by a Peruvian sociologist. His name was Quijano, and he wrote a very influential article, which we consider one of the pillars of decolonial thinker. And that article talks about what he calls the concept of the colonial matrix of power. And Quijano found that there are multiple pillars that constitute the colonial matrix of power, where power has a grip on all of us. One of them is institutions. So, for example, a US university is wonderful, but let's say a university in Sierra Leone, nobody cares. If you say, I have a PhD from Sierra Leone, but if you say, I have a PhD from Harvard, do you see how people hear that? That is colonization. But we know knowledge has many ways to get. It doesn't have to be from Harvard. So to decolonize is to take things seriously. So Quijano looks at how, for example, education is a pillar, knowledge production, which we call epistemology. For example, sexuality is one, like how the family and all of us are disciplined by powers. That is another, they tell us what is right, what is wrong, how should men be, how should women behave. That is another part of the matrix, right? And other matrix. I encourage you to read about it. I have an article that I can share the link that goes in depth about everything. Some of you are saying you should write about this. I have written a very big article, 30 something pages. So I'm going to share the link at some point with you. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't want to be going forever because it's a huge question, but I hope that did some justice.
This is amazing, especially the example and how when you want to write a book, you should be willing to read it. And this is the reason why you write. And also you talked about something really important and personally I'm very interested in is archiving. So you need to archive around you the stories of the people and everything related to your community as well. So yes, and thank you so much for sharing the link in the chat. So as you said, like decolonizing is really a big thing. but and you mentioned some important things on where we should start by thinking about it. So let's maybe ask about what are the challenges when it comes to decolonizing, because we live in places where institutions fund, let's say, research and all of that. So how can what's the challenge there, and how can we overcome it, if you
Oh,
want
I
to?
love this
I know
question so much.
it's a big
It is,
question, I know.
it's a great question. And I do address it in the article. That's not to say I'm not going to talk about it, but I want people to know it's also there. This article
Yeah.
was one of the biggest projects. I spent so much time on it. But um, so how do we do it, right? Is the question. How, like the challenges.
Yeah, the challenges
Yeah,
and of that, because we want to start somewhere. We have the
yeah,
tools, but there are certain obstacles that, hinder this, and these
yeah.
are institutions, the funding, and all of that.
I think the first challenge is us, because to be decolonized, to be colonized, and there are many ways to colonize. You could, if you keep watching movies where the hero is always a white, beautiful man with blonde hair, and never a black person with curly, and if they are a criminal in the movie. If you watch cartoons when it's always snowing and people are eating apples, but never, for example, a palm tree, or never something else that other people have, like a corn, like in South America, then you begin to think that the only beautiful things are the things represented. And the media, you study the visual things.
Yeah.
The Nigerian novelist Adichie has a very famous YouTube video that I strongly recommend to all of you. It's very beautiful, which answers Noor's point. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. It's a very effective, beautiful video. She talks, I think it's a TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story on YouTube. And she talks about this as a writer. She's a novelist, right? And this is one of the things that we teach in decolonizing knowledge. So the first challenge is us. We growing up not seeing our value, devalued, thinking that, oh, can I ever theorize? Am I ever good enough to think? Like many examples of us not valuing who we are, because we're constantly bombarded that all intelligent knowledge comes from Europe. All the beautiful people have a blonde hair and blue eyes. And they are beautiful, but they're not the only beauty. Because what is beauty? Beauty is what you get exposed to, what you become familiar with. Sometimes what is beautiful, if you linger, it becomes ugly. You discover the ugliness that is in the soul. And sometimes what looks not so beautiful, as you sit and talk more and linger, you see another kind of beauty. So so the first thing to decolonize is decolonize what we know about ourselves, how we value ourselves. But then beyond that, there's a lot of real challenges. For example, as Noor said, for example, who gives the funding, who has the money, and the people who have the money can control what is important knowledge. So for example, we will fund a project that studies this topic, but not the other topic. But for example, you might think that this other topic is more important for you, wherever you are. You are in Ghana, Nigeria, in Tunisia. And so that is a challenge. Who has the money controls the knowledge. And so what do? We have to be very strong and challenge that and write independently. I personally have found writing independently a very big, important part of my journey as an anthropologist. I didn't want anyone to twist my arm and tell me you can only get money to write about this. So that's another big challenge. The language we use, and I have a whole section in the article, the very language we use, if you sit with yourselves and unpack that language and examine it, you see it's full of colonial things. For example, in the Middle East, Lebanon, where Noor comes from, is a beautiful country. Everybody says Lebanon is the Switzerland of the Middle East. But Lebanon has a much deeper, older culture than Switzerland, or equal. Let's say equal. If I want to be very optimist or very, why don't we call Switzerland the Lebanon of Europe? Because it's a colonial language. You only measure through Europe. You only measure through the West, the ones who have power, the colonial power. So the language we use is very colonial. Everybody thinks people travel to they say, I want to travel and see the world, and they only go to Europe. Europe is not the world. I mean, if you haven't gone to Africa and Central Asia and Russia and Japan and all the other, you haven't seen anything about the world. You've seen much of the same. Europe is its own, small part of the world, and it is very beautiful, but there's a lot more. And I can't tell you how many people who tell me, I want to see the world, so I'm going to France and Germany and New Zealand and Australia, only Western. Oh, you're seeing the world. How wonderful. That is a colonial way of thinking, right? So we need to do this work ourselves. So what language are we using? Not seeing, as I said, the value of ourselves. And then we need to challenge the institutions. And if we teach, we need to challenge the syllabi that we use. One of my friends who is an African-American and half Native American, we were joking. It was a joke, to be very fair. But he told me, I just finished my syllabus and there's not a single white author. It's all like Native American. I just didn't have space. He was joking a bit. It was funny. But to me, that is important to decolonize. Bring the knowledge other people are producing. What Native Americans, Indians are writing, and the poets, what Lebanese writers are saying, what Egyptian writers are saying, what the writers in China are saying. So decolonizing is all of that. We need to be very aware of that stuff. So when you sit, whether you're preparing a syllabus or whether you're actually reading, be very critical. What should I put in my syllabus to be representative? And also what should I read? And when I read only Europeans, are they enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, and then you start to find equivalent knowledge in your own cultures. That's another, point. I actually, there's a very old Sudanese proverb from Sudan. It says, give every child wings and roots. And I love that. It's a very old saying. And it means that teach every person to know how to have the power and the ability to have roots, but also be able to fly and go see the world. And I found an idea exactly like that by Goethe, the German writer, who's a great writer. But the Sudanese didn't need Goethe to tell them that. They have already said it. And there are many places where there is equivalent knowledge. It's just that one is ignored and one is glorified.
Yeah,
and that is what it means to decolonize. And the challenges are many. I think I can't do justice to them, but I have listed most of them in the article that I shared with you that I hope you will be able to.
Yes, and I encourage everyone to read that because it has very important information, very interesting ones. Maybe I could ask one more questions before we take the Q&A, and it's related to one of the questions that Agnes also asked in the chat. And how can you become an anthropologist? It's also related to my question, which are if you can share any insights or recommendations for aspiring anthropologists, maybe practitioners interested in taking anthropology and applying it for community-based social change or in their own disciplines as well. So how can someone start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you think you want to become an anthropologist, that means you already have a fire. That beautiful fire, which means that you're curious about the world, about people, about languages, about why we say the things we say, why we do the things we do. And that already makes you, it's a very big step towards wanting to become anthropology. And then when you begin taking courses in anthropology, and nowadays they've evolved a lot. Evolved is not my favorite word. Let's say they have been revised and changed so that more readings are included. But one of the first things you will learn when you take an advanced degree, especially a master's, but even you can do that actually as a like intro to anthropology, which I think Noor knows well, and she teaches that, I believe. You begin to get exposed to a lot of theories of anthropology, beginning from the history of anthropology, and then which as Noor said earlier, it has a very colonial. Anthropology has a very bad reputation in terms of its history, very colonial, because at first, when they went to study, for example, African communities and Native American communities, it was to serve the Western powers. They got funding. And some of the work done was very good, but it wasn't perfect. It lacked understanding. It was practical simply to serve certain purposes. For example, one of the key people we read in theories in anthropology is Evans Pritchard. Pritchard is a British anthropologist who went to study Sudan. He went to study the newer people of Sudan particularly. And he was, I mean, his writings were serving the British Empire at the time in terms of what he studied. Now, if you read his works, they are very interesting, how he does it and but that needs to change. When you come to the table, wherever you're from, if you're from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Uganda, Sierra Leone, South Africa, name it, wherever you are, you're going to bring your own way. And what you see, going back to Toni Morrison's idea, if there's a book that nobody has written and you want it to be read, write it. So you become the one making that contribution. The first thing I have some kind of a funny rule that I like in writing, but it applies to anthropology, is that it's okay to break any rules as long as you can show the reader that you know them very well. Some people want to break the rules, but they actually don't know them. So when they're breaking them, they're just looking incompetent. But when you read the literature well and the theories and the history of anthropology, and then you decolonize it, then when you do your project, whatever you do, you will know what you're doing because you're making a contribution, but also challenging the existing contribution. And I think any knowledge should do that. I think any book, any article should never have a final word. It should open doors to other books and other articles. Any question I ask, it should open the door for 2 other questions to be born out of it, right? So that is what anthropology is. And so to do it is to be familiar with its history and learn a little bit about its theories. But also, I would say, I strongly advise wherever you are to begin digging deeper into what other people have said who are not called anthropologists. Because again, just because you're not called anthropologist, it doesn't mean that you can't find anthropology elsewhere. So you can find anthropology in many places. For example, when Tolstoy in Russia was writing, he is the famous Russian writer, right? Tolstoy is well known. He wrote Peace and War, his famous big novel. He was writing in a time when a lot of historians did not have freedoms to express their scholarship openly and honestly. Tolstoy wrote a novel, and many people later discovered that you learn much more about the period by reading Tolstoy than reading a lot of historians. Because as a novelist, he captured the society very deeply and very well. So you learn very well from his writing what was going on in the society. This is an example, and I gave you just like one example. There are many like this, where the point I'm trying to make, try to seek where there might be people who did the work. They don't have to be called anthropologists. There might be a poet from Kenya who actually did enough work that could teach us about the Kenyan culture, struggles, corruption, whatever, you name it, right? So be an investigative also, because to apply anthropology and to do it, it means you have to search for it, and then you do your own project. That's what I was saying, that know the rules well before you even begin to challenge them, to show that you know what you're doing, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's amazing. I also have one example that I would share, but first maybe we can share Gideon's comment and saying that there's the idea that decolonization usually results in rhetoric rather than material things on the ground. What do you think about this sort of critique, and how would you counter it? So
That's
this
a
is a
very good point, and I've heard
very
it before.
interesting point.
It's
Yeah.
a really good point, and thank you for really saying that, because that point is used a lot, especially by certain people, to attack decolonial thinkers. They're saying, you're just talking these fancy talks, but what do we do? I mean, that's why the article I wrote, it's called Decolonizing Knowledge Production, a Practical Guide. The fact that I called it a practical guide is to answer to that. And I talk specifically about grants, about the language we use. This is all practical. I mean, what is not practical about this? What is not real about this? And so when I say grants are given only to study projects that serve the West, that can be proven easily how it serves, because even anthropology in its history has that. And so then what is the solution? The solution is to stop only getting grants from the West, or to challenge the things that the West wants us to study, or else they won't give us money. So this is all practical. I'm not saying that this is some fancy, rosy, abstract talk. So that is what it means. When I say the colonial language, we use the language that is very colonial. Again, there are practical steps we can take to decolonize that language. Why do we say the things we say? Where did they come from, right? And so there are steps you can take to look at that language, analyze it, and even change it. Because language is a living cell. You can feed it, it can be malnourished like any cell. It can be weak, it can be strong, it can be changed. Language is a living thing, and its livelihood depends on how we use it and how we think about it, right? And so here's another question, another point. This is very practical stuff. Excuse me. Another practical thing. You're sitting to write a research in anthropology. Let's say you're undergraduate. Let's say you're a master's student. When you sit and write, and if you see yourself let's say you're doing literature review of your topic, and every line you're saying, and the German scholar said this, and the American scholar said this, you wait a minute and you should say, why I don't see any Chinese writers, anyone from Kazakhstan, I don't see anybody from Niger or Mali. Why? That is, well, there are practical steps. Then you could actually go search for them. If you can't find them, you've hitting another challenge. Going back to the question of challenges, it means only certain knowledge is made available and translated. And so one big benefits we have as decolonizing knowledge is that if we speak more than one language, we get a lot of exposure. I'm fluent in 5 languages, and I've read literature in all of them, things in all of them. And I've used that in my work. I mean, for example, I'll give you an example. Again, going back to the practical, how it's not just some fancy word. There was a philosopher that I was writing about from Syria when I was doing my research. I saw every Western writer clearly didn't speak Arabic enough to read his deep philosophies. He has many books. They only took tidbits. One person took tidbits and attacked that philosopher and said, oh, he's just imitating German romantic thinkers. And I thought about it, and I looked at what he was doing. I read all his work. Now, this is a huge project I did, right? I read all his books. I spent months reading it. And I found that the claim is false, and it's very colonial. And they're just dismissing another thinker because he's from Syria. So I decided to actually, for the first time, write a whole chapter about him in depth and actually use the language in Arabic, what he wrote, which nobody had done. They've only taken 1 or 2 lines and said, and dismissed him, and they're done. And I looked consistently at everything written about him in the West, and it was the same line. 1 or 2 people have translated 2 lines, and then everybody was copying them because it's a colonial thinking. They decided to dismiss somebody, right? So that's how you can do it. So if you see that there is great works, but by a poet that is in your country or in community, and nobody is talking about it, I mean, you think there's value, or you think that poet is saying something as valuable as the French poet Baudelaire, then bring that poet. If you speak the language, you have an added strength that you can actually translate it and analyze it and present it to the world to be read, right? So these are all practical ways. I don't see how these can't be practical ways to change. And going back to the title of this talk, how do we use anthropology to change? These are all ways, and there are many others. But I don't want to dwell too much because I know time. I want to be mindful of time.
This is amazing. I'm loving the discussion. Maybe we can start by the questions, because we have some questions. So that's
ask anything you want, and you can even attack me. That's fine. I don't mind it at all.
No attack.
No, from people, they can even disagree or say, I love that because I learned from the question they just asked about the question that we just talked about from the attendees. It is a very good question. I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's always brought up to the table as a challenge, as if decolonial thinking is some fancy thing. Or what does it mean really to put it into practice? And one of the things about decolonial thought, by the way, that I love, and decolonial thinkers have said this many times, they say the power of it lies in that it's open-ended. There isn't one recipe. And if you want to call yourself decolonial thinker or writer or poet, and you're going that route, it's beautiful to know that you are in an open-ended field, meaning that at any given time, you can decide how to do something, how to write about it, right? So writers in exile from many countries, and I've written about this somewhere, I don't remember where exactly, but writers in exile have always challenged the language, that the way it's used. They feel that language is not adequate always to capture the experience of exile and alienation. And so they find new ways of putting languages. So sometimes that is something we need to do. You need to do that work instead of saying, oh, it's fancy and there's nothing to be done about it. So I love that you asked that question. Thank you very much for bringing it up.
Thank you, really. We have a question from Agnes. It's since you may know human behaviors, how do you tolerate and cope with certain unusual behaviors of others? That's a very interesting question.
Can you read it again? I'm sorry, I lost it.
Of course. So since you may know human behaviors, how do you tolerate and cope with certain unusual behaviors of others?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm understanding it fully, not because of you, Noor, but the question itself, because it has more than one way to answer and to think about. For example, do you mean that some human behaviors are so terrible and difficult, so how can you even sympathize with them as an anthropologist? If you do say yes, that's what I mean. But also you could mean that like some of them could be so different and so unlike you and everything you know. So how do you begin to understand them? So there is that angle, right?
Yeah, the
so I'm going to try
thing. Yeah,
otherness, right. And I'm going to try different directions so that the benefit is bigger of this question. One thing is going back to the question of how do you become an anthropologist and what makes an anthropologist. I think the answer could be very true for how do you become a writer and how do you become a poet, which is as a writer, as a person who wants to think, when you're growing up, you immediately are sensitive about what's going on, what people are doing, what people are saying, and why. And you even question things that don't make sense. You say everything they're saying, everybody is saying this, but it doesn't seem right. You know what I mean? Like you begin to question. And also you become shocked with the paradoxes. I mean, for example, as children, everyone is telling us don't use bad language, but all the adults are using it in front of us. They fight, they get angry, and they cuss, right? And so as a child, I'm speaking as a child, innocent. I'm immediately disgusted and like I see a paradox, what contradiction, right? So then that makes you begin to think, why is this the case? And those are the beginnings, right, of being curious about this. So then that is one way. But then another thing about why an anthropologist becomes an anthropologist is that because very often you belong to a community, but you feel as an outsider. So then what happens is you become, you are an insider who feels like an outsider, but then you go elsewhere and you feel like you're an outsider, but never an insider. And so you always find yourself wrestling between multiple worlds, trying to cling and to understand all these multiple worlds, but never belonging fully to any of them. And that is not a bad thing. Not belonging is not a bad thing because it always keeps you on the edge. When you come to the edge of the hill, you see more of the field than when you are in the middle, far away from the edge. So being on the edge is a good thing in thinking, in writing, in anthropology. So then, because you're an outsider, I would say, to answer your question, if you meant that, how do you deal with behaviors that are very, let's say, difficult and shocking for you? Like, let's say you won't accept them. They sound horrible and you're studying a community. Well, the job of any social scientist, especially an anthropologist, is not to love it, to hate it, to think it's cute, to think it's ugly. One thing I recommend is that you get rid of adjectives. Oh, this is beautiful. This is ugly. Oh, I don't like this. Oh, look at this. This is disgusting. Why do they eat this food? Your job is not get rid of adjectives and begin to understand. So your word is to understand. There's a poet from Dagestan who wrote, Dagestan is a country, small country in the Caucasus, beautiful mountainous country, who wrote, he was walking one day and he saw a door with a lock on it, and somebody wrote, this lock has a key, don't break it. I love that very much. And he wrote it as a poem, that exact story that I just told you. That every relationship, every human, every community you want to try to answer, think of it as a lock. Do you have the key? Or are you going to say, this is disgusting, I'm going to break it and enter? Do not break this door, this lock. It has a key. And the question is, do you have the key? The key is the understanding. Why do these people eat this meal? Because thousands of years, this is all they grew, maybe, and because that's all they had access to, so they made food from what the earth gave them. So today, that's the main thing. You think it's disgusting because you're from a nicer big city and you can go to all the restaurants, but that's not how anthropology works. We need to begin to understand why things are done that way. People have even traditions and values that we might be against. They could be cruel. We want to understand not how things are, but how they became the way they are. That is the key line. Not how things are, how they became the way they are. So that's a very important thing to think about, I think. So if that's the angle that you meant in your question, I hope it's sort of tried it. You try to understand and remove the adjectives. What is ugly? What is right? What is wrong? And actually, the poet Rumi famously said, you know, beyond the wrong and the right and the beautiful and the ugly, there's a field. I will meet you there. Beyond all of these adjectives, there's another space. We can meet there. And that space is understanding. Now, understanding may not make you love a value or a practice, but it can definitely not make you hate because you understand the context from which it started to become the case. It can make you sympathize. It can make you, so understanding rarely, if ever, I would say, at least in my life, in my dictionary, it rarely leads to hate. It leads to all kinds of things, but not hate. because when you know why things are done this way, then you know, and that's it. And so then you might even know ideas to change, and that's great. And that's where anthropology can make a difference and share ideas and knowledge with people. And I don't want to forget to say, we have to be very honoring and very transparent and honest with the people we study, and represent them very well, and even ask their permission about, let me reiterate, is that what you mean? I'm going to put it this way. Does this sound fair? And that's why language matters, even when you talk to, by the way, anthropologists still call it informants. I'm not a big fan of that word, because it comes from the colonial anthropology legacy, informants, that you're informing on others. So I go to study you, you're informant, and I take whatever you say and go use it against you. Today, we use the word interlocutors, which suggests that we are conversing. So if I come to study Agnes or Andrew or Noor or Angela, they are not informants. If I want to study, they are conversing with me. And so they are, in fact, in anthropology, because all the knowledge we have in a book comes from people, they're not only interlocutors, they are co-authors. They're authoring with us, and we have to do much justice to that as well.
Of course, that's so true. Thank you for pointing this out. We have a question from Diodon. To what extent in nowadays anthropology play a role in advancement of well-being of community? And this is a really
very good question.
Nice
and yeah, very nice question. And honestly, I would want to hear what you think about this, Noor, as well.
Yes, I have an example on this.
Yeah, go ahead, please. I want to hear what you think, given what I know about you.
It's a recent example, and I thought of it after you shared one. There's a person in Lebanon. She does not call herself an anthropologist. She calls herself a drama therapist. And what she does basically is she does drama or theater to create therapy with the people she does theater with. But I want to think of her as an anthropologist, because what she did is basically she studied the prisons of Lebanon, in the prison. And what she did, she went for a year and a half to the office of some, the people who give you approvals and stuff. And she sat for 1 year and a half there every day, going just to take an approval to go inside of the prison and create theater, only theater. She just wanted to do drama theater in the prison. So after a year and a half, she said that they were done with, they were done with her coming every time to their office. So they just gave her approval, and she went into the prison and she did a theater performance with the prisoners. They were the actors and actresses in the prison, and she invited authorities from outside of Lebanon into the prison to watch these people perform. For me, this was revolutionary, because this is what the well-being of a community is. And what she did is she changed the law. She basically decreased the law of people staying in prison if they had good behaviors. She also tapped into many things as well, the women prison, the men prison, but she actually had the courage and power to reform the law. So I think this is what anthropology does. It basically points out to what people are going through, as you said, living with them, hearing, understanding them, even people in prison, because these people are there for a reason, and we should be able to understand their experiences, and not in an authority kind of way, to be able to talk to them. So I don't know if this answers the question, but this is an example of well-being for me, at least.
I love that. And I think many anthropologists, sociologists have written some version of the idea that it's absurd to only punish people, like prison, instead of looking at the causes that make people go to prison. Poverty could lead people to crime, to stealing, for example. So then what do you focus on? On building a very strong prison system, or sort of dealing with and tackling the issues that make people behave in ways that take them to prison? And again, the idea of how did things become the way they are, right? But going back to the question, I think this is a really good question. All the questions are wonderful, and you guys are just making me want to talk forever. So the question is, I think we need to also add that the challenges are the challenges that we discussed earlier, including the decolonizing challenges. For example, the challenge of funding. How do you study what you think is impactful also, as opposed to when funding is available only for certain things, right? I'm trying to think of other. Can you repeat the question just so I want to do it justice
Of course.
100%?
To what extent in nowadays anthropology play a role in the advancement of well-being of community?
Yes. And so sadly, I would say it could do much more, because anthropologists have always said that nobody or very few people understand the diversity of the world and the different ways of thinking and doing and sensing the world like anthropologists. So we know a lot more than the typical other, people. And so it's a shame that we don't let other people to know that there are many ways to be in this world. So, for example, in the West, everybody is fighting. Are you a socialist? Are you a capitalist? Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Politics, right? But anthropologists know many other ways of doing even financial systems that existed in tribes. We know other ways of thinking and philosophies that certain tribes and certain groups of people like that are very different than what we know about.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that is a challenge. The challenge is that the world is not knowing about other ways of doing, other ways of thinking. We're caught between the fighting powers, which tend to be Western, capitalism, socialism. We're caught between these two, but there are many other ways to be, right? And so that's another challenge. So I think anthropology, the answer is could do a lot more, but sadly, because of things like funding, because of another thing I don't like. That's why I love applied anthropology, and I love what they call public intellectualism, is that you need to talk to the people, not only sit with a circle of academics or write one book that nobody will read except your doctor, your PhD, advisor. You need to write to people, reach out to them, because you learn from them and you want to give them back. And that's how you change. And a lot of anthropologists, a lot of great anthropological works are hidden and many people don't know about. And so that's another challenge. There are many, but I want to do some justice to your question. It's a really good question. And I hope it opens doors for all of you to start thinking, what are the ways to do this?
Thank you. Okay, another question. So Nyakesho is asking, due to the fact that anthropologists study society, how can we change the attitude of our people in the society to accept Africa? Because most of them believe Europe is the best country. I agree with
that's a global problem. I have, as you know, I mean, many parts of the world feel that way. I mean, the Chinese people think the dream is in America or it's in Europe. It's not just African, problem. And it is a problem because of centuries of how colonization operated. The colonization, as we said, is not only to actually attack a country. Some decolonial thinkers have written even about China, and they said China was never colonized, but it never escaped colonialism. That's an important distinction. And that's just one example. But the idea is that the colonization doesn't have to be a war and invading a place, even though that's horrible. But there are many ways, through products, through the movies you watch. And so people think the way they do because of the strong grip in media, knowledge production, that only glorifies the West and ignores the rest. So there's that West and rest. The rest are ignored. And so to begin to that, as you ask in your question, it's a lot of work and it's a hard work, but it begins with conversations, with writing, with confronting questions, and with looking at new and different angles to think about things. You see what I mean? Yeah. So that's what we need to do. And it's hard. It's a lot of work. And that's why we need to keep talking and find the right people who are also doing the work. And there are some really good people out there. I encourage you to start thinking about decolonial writing. In the article, I mentioned some key names, the one I shared with you earlier, of people you could look at. You can begin with Frantz Fanon. He is very relevant for your question. Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, that book, that's like one of the key books to begin thinking about how do we decolonize ourselves.
Yeah, I will also type that in a moment. Okay, so we have another also interesting question from Silas. Thank you so much for your passion in decolonization knowledge production. Wondering who approves the textbooks we use, who awards ISBNs, and in whose interests do they give the ISBNs? Well, thank you. Much love from Uganda. Thank you. Much
Hmm.
love to you too.
Oh, likewise, likewise. So the question, can you reiterate it? Just make sure I understand it correctly. Sorry.
Yes. So, wondering who approves the textbooks we use, who awards ISBNs, and in whose interests do they give the ISBNs?
This is a huge question, and it's about, again, it's about knowledge production. That's why I'm super interested in that question. And I can tell you that's almost, for me, it's not a one-time thing. It's a life journey of thinking about that question. But basically, those who control the money and the power, and they control the knowledge. But there's one more important factor here, is that I think he was a writer, his name was Trio from Haiti. And he wrote a beautiful book. I don't recall the name, but it's about how the process of knowledge production works from the moment you write to the moment you submit to a publication, and how it goes through the pipe. And it's a very decolonial-like work. But of course, I think his book is talking about Haiti, the history and everything. But in his introduction chapter, he talks about the processes of knowledge production. And he talks about how every knowledge production, especially coming from colonial, from the center, it's full of silences and blind spots. And so a lot of the books that are out there, they're the famous, the ISBN, and they are, everybody wants to read, everybody should put in their syllabus. They are full of blind spots, and they're full of erased voices. And to decolonize is to go back to these voices and find ways to bring them back to life, right? And for example, going back to the colonial language, if you notice, they always say Native Americans have wisdom, but Europeans have philosophy. They never say Native Americans are also philosophers, seeing how beautifully they think. They have some amazing concepts. So the others are wise, and the Europeans or Americans, they are philosophers. Some have theory, some have stories. Tell us your story. You're a story always. Stories are powerful and beautiful, but that's not all we are, just a story to be heard and feel sad for. We are much more than a story. And
yes,
so we need to challenge, not only be storytellers, but how do we tell the story on our own, with our own voices, on our own terms. So these are all ways to start thinking about those kind of questions. So if you notice about the language, for example, it's almost another country that is dictator, or they have a regime, but the West is always a democracy, no matter what they do, what kind of wars they engage in, how many people, how many millions die from the war, but they're always a democracy. But as soon as another country does something, they are a dictatorship, they are a regime. But you see the language, that's what I'm talking about, when we need to really critically examine that language, because that is a colonial language. Double standards. We're called very, if you have a bachelor's or have a master's and you go work in France, let's say you go from Cameroon to France, you are an immigrant. But if you're American and go to Uganda, you are an expat. So even the word is much fancier for them, right? So this is all colonial. Why is somebody an immigrant or just a refugee and the others are always expats? So there are many ways to think about this.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Try to answer them maybe before time is not on our
Anur, feel free to answer some, because you have a lot of good insights, please.
Thank you. Okay, so Wisdom is asking, I think that our biggest problem here in Africa is with mediocrity. However, I have a certain strong belief that we have the capacity and the capability to loosen ourselves from the shackles of mediocrity, which has plunged us into complacency. My question is, how can we get out of this mediocre attitude? Interesting.
I want to say that, to me, that's a statement that I appreciate. It's very hard for me to actually answer it as a question, because quite honestly, I see it in many places beyond Africa. I mean, I've traveled to so many countries and I see there is that. But I think the question of mediocrity in some ways is also the question of power. Power rewards mediocrity, because mediocrity bows over to power. And I think it was he was an American sociologist, a very good one. I don't remember his name right now, but I remember he said that the core of any social science question is power. Any question you study, you're studying power and power relations. So even mediocrity is formed as part of how power relations work. How many of us have always said things like, oh, people who work very hard, they get punished, and those who are doing nothing, they get promoted, for example. or this student is just, being a hypocrite with the teacher, but they're getting, what they want, and I'm working very hard. So this power has its own dynamics, and I can't have a recipe how do you get rid of it, but I can tell you it's way beyond Africa, and what it takes is for people to keep talking and exposing it. I would say, and I have to use a poetic language to say this, as opposed to an anthropological language, I guess. I think, who was it who said, be a poet even in prose? It was the French Baudelaire, be a poet even in prose. The answer is that we should always find ways to object. A big part of knowledge and doing what we think is conscientious and not being complacent is to object, to say no. And negation and saying no is not a bad thing at all. It can change lives. It can change our lives. It can make people start to see another perspective. So that's one way, but there are others. And I assure you, the issue is maybe global, far from just an African issue, I think.
One question, is anthropology applicable in genetic variation and evolution?
Oh, yes. There's a lot of critique. Anthropology has made, I think, some very bad and then later better contributions to that, because there was this whole evolution that suggested some people are evolved and they're better than others, and some genes are better than others. And for example, the idea of evolving, even the idea of evolve, like when you hear somebody saying, this society hasn't evolved, this village hasn't evolved, what they mean, it hasn't become more westernized. So to think of evolving in two problematic ways. The first one, that it's linear instead of multi-directional. We evolve in many different directions, and there isn't one right one. And to assume that evolving meaning becoming more like the West and having whatever the West thinks is civilized, right? So that is a very big problem. And anthropology has done a lot of work in critiquing that issue, but also there are others who have done work that contributed to the sort of very problematic narrative of people evolving in certain ways and some genes and others. So something I encourage you to read more about. It is out there, and it is something very important to think about. I know we're going over time, so I don't want people to.
Yes, maybe we can ask Angela if it's if it's fine. We can ask 2 more questions. I don't want to also keep people.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have one question also from Wisdom. It says, what can you say about our leaders in Africa concerning their posture and demeanor towards leaders in Europe? I just feel they act cowardice towards them on discussion tables. What do you think the problem is, and what can be done about it? That's a really interesting question.
Well, I think the core of this question, I'm not going to get deeply into the politics because not because I'm afraid, but because the answer varies from country to country. There isn't one answer for every African country or for every country in the world, especially places that were either colonized directly or not, like I have this kind of power thing with Europe and the US. But I would say the answer is, in anthropology, there has been a lot written about the direct rule and the indirect rule. The indirect rule being the idea that you put people, local people in place who do the job of the colonizer. So if the colonizer think that people should all be doing service industry and never have a factory to build planes, then that's what the local government will focus on, making sure that you never have your planes, always bring them from Europe or buy them from somewhere else, be always dependent. So there's that indirect role. And that's why a lot of us in this world, we say, oh, how could this government represent these people? Because these people are so smart. They seem to have a lot of potential, but the government doesn't seem to be offering service. This is a very big thing. We've heard it everywhere. You heard it in Lebanon. We hear it in Iraq, in many countries. People not feeling they're represented. That's because of how power again works. So I will suffice with that, but I will also say, depending on the leader and the period and what they've done and what ended up happening. So every case would be different to study in its own terms. And if you're interested, here is a good anthropological work. I think some of this has been written about this exact work. I forgot the title, but the writer, let me write his name. He's from South Africa. I think this is the writer, Achille Mbemba, and he wrote a book about exactly how the local corruption and how it rules. So check out his books, and you will know from the title of the book that this is it. That's a very good South African writer and theorist as well. To explore, he's very decolonial also. He's a great thinker.
Gideon is also, speaking of authors, is also asking to provide some text maybe or books on the topic of decolonization. So I
would say a great person to read these days, you have, here, I'm writing them for you. This is from Argentina. And you have, oh, I have in the article some names. I can't remember them, but this is one of the big ones. He was actually on my PhD committee. He's a very big name of decolonial thinkers. And he has some really important books, like The Dark Side of Western, the Dark Side of Western Civilization, or something like that. But there are authors I mentioned in the article that I shared. If you look at some part of it, in the early parts, there are some names where you can check them out. And I've mentioned Frantz Fanon. I think he's a key. I don't know, was it written before, or should I write him now? I'm writing Frantz Fanon. Check him out, really good, especially The Wretched of the Earth, a really good book.
Thank you for the wonderful recommendations.
Sure.
Maybe we could end with a question from Nyaka Shosh, asking, do you believe inferiority is attributed or earned? Because Africans are considered to be inferior, even though we invent something, it doesn't go beyond our boundaries, and our ideas are used to create European inventions. So inferiority attributed or earned, this is something to think about. But
no, I mean, it is constructed. It is part of the colonial matrix of power to make some people feel they are inferior, they have nothing to contribute. Every human being, whoever they are, wherever they are, however they look, they are a product of everything that happens to them. So if they face crime and drugs, then they might be drug addicts. If they face good schooling and good ideas and books in the house, they'll be good readers and good thinkers. We are humans. We begin in the same point, although even when we begin, we are not the same people. We are very different. Some of us begin wanting to make contribution to farming, and there's nothing wrong with that. We need it as much as we need a poetry book. But we all begin at a base. But then everything that happens to us and the society and the power surrounding us, from family to church to politics to anything, think about it. They produce and they make us, they shape us. So the question is, how do we get rid of that? How do we decolonize and break free from that? So no, inferiority is constructed, is colonially constructed, and yeah, it is a very sad fact that has been such a horrific consequences on our humanity, and particularly on Africa, of course, without any doubt. But I would say to many other people in the world, and we need to challenge that. And the beginning to me is to begin to see our beauty, to begin to think, to appreciate what we're thinking, and take ourselves seriously. And that's not to be arrogant, to be dismissive of others. Again, the idea that I started with Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese writer, that you don't know people, like you don't know yourself until you know as many people as possible. And that's something that we need to wrestle with at all times.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Yako,
It
for
was
your
a
insights,
pleasure.
for your amazing examples, experience. It was just amazing.
It was really a pleasure. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful actually talks, because it's near and dear to my heart, and I'm so grateful for you and Angela for making this happen, and for the dear people who attended. Stay in touch. I'm out there if you want to connect. I even have Facebook if somebody want to connect with me. It will be a pleasure, because I publish a lot of my writings there. But truly, it was a pleasure, and I hope you found this, some meaning in this. Some seeds, if that is.
Thank you for all of those who attended, really, for your questions, because you created the discussion, and it's amazing. Thank you so much, Angela and Tiffany, for being here and helping with all of this.
Oh, and thank you, Tiffany. Yes, Tiffany is here.
Thank you. That's amazing.
Yes.
And I hope you have a good day, good evening, wherever you are in the world.
And
thank you. We're of course going to stay in touch, stay connected.
Likewise. You all have a very good one, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You and I were brave.